What do you do with extra sourdough starter? How do you turn something you might normally throw away into a treat worth keeping? And what happens when you combine sourdough starter with browned butter? I'm Evie, and today I'm showing you how to make browned butter sourdough chocolate chip cookies, a delicious way to use your sourdough discard while creating cookies with a rich, toffee-like flavor. Whether you're new to sourdough or you've been baking for years, this is the discard recipe you need. Let's get started. Here is a list of the kitchen tools you'll need for this recipe, and this is a list of the ingredients. Notice that this recipe can call for active or inactive sourdough starter, whichever you have on hand when you're ready to prepare the cookie dough. Inactive starter is starter that has not been fed recently and is often referred to as sourdough discard, and I use these terms interchangeably. First, we're browning the butter. This step is what gives these cookies their signature flavor, adding depth and a hint of toffee flavor, so let's take our time and do it right. I'm using 1 stick of butter, 113 grams, and placed it into a saucepan over medium heat. Medium heat is important here. If the heat is too high, the butter will likely burn before it browns. As the butter melts, it'll start to bubble, and this is normal. The water in the butter is evaporating. Now watch for the foam. When the buttery bubbles start to look like foam, you're only seconds away from seeing the butter brown and smelling that toffee aroma. There it is. See how the bubbles start to look like foam? And notice how the color underneath is more of a medium brown color? This is exactly what we want. Keep stirring gently and watch the color. It should be a rich golden brown, not dark brown or black. If it smells nutty and toasted, you're right where you need to be. Turn off the stove and remove the pot from the heat source. Typically, I would pour 75 grams of the browned butter into the mixing bowl and let it cool there while I did other small tasks for about 10 to 15 minutes. But in this instance, it was 6 in the morning and I was in a bit of a rush to prepare these cookies for my coworkers. So I decided to do a little experiment and put the pot in an ice bath to cool the butter faster. Turns out this will cool down the butter very quickly, but while I was measuring the other ingredients, the butter began to solidify and became cold within 5 minutes. Note for next time, I'll stir the butter consistently for about a minute or two, and that should be more than enough time for the brown butter to cool on ice and still retain its smoothness. I wound up having to use the rounded end of a dough scraper to scrape the butter out of the pot into the bowl. I measured out again the 75 grams, but you're welcome to use all of the brown butter if you wish. I've just found that this amount works best for my taste. I used a fork to break it up a bit, and while you watch me do that, I'll share another tip about butter temperature. If your butter is too hot when you add the sugar in the next step, it can melt the sugar too quickly and affect the texture. It's okay if the butter is a little warm, but having it right at about or a little above room temperature is ideal. Or if you're in a rush, like I said, you could put your pot or bowl of browned butter in an ice bath, but just make sure to stir it consistently to avoid having it solidify like it did for me. Okay, now that the butter has cooled down, it's time to add the sugars and wet ingredients. I'm adding 200 grams of brown sugar and 40 grams of cane sugar to the bowl of brown butter, mixing these together until they're well combined, and we want it to look grainy and thick. That's what we're expecting it to look like. This mixture is the base for our cookies, and it smells really good with all that brown butter in there. Now for the star ingredient, sourdough starter. I'm using discard that I pulled from the fridge. This discard had been in the fridge for a few days and it separated a little bit, which is completely normal. So I'm stirring it up before adding it to the dough. This redistributes the liquid and makes it easier to measure. Don't be surprised if you see bubbles when you stir the discard. Even refrigerated sourdough discard can have some activity, and that's a good sign. It means your starter is alive and well. I'm adding 64 grams of starter for this recipe. Now, before we go on, I'll answer a few questions I have received about using sourdough starter in recipes like this. Question 1. What's the purpose of adding starter? Especially when we're talking about something that's not actually sourdough bread. Well, the sourdough starter really adds complexity to the flavor. You get a subtle tanginess that balances the sweetness of the cookies, and it brings depth that regular cookies just don't have. Does the starter have to be active? No, you can use active starter or discard. Both work beautifully in this recipe. And in fact, this is one of the best uses for discard because you're not relying on it to leaven the dough. We're using baking soda and baking powder for that. The starter is here for flavor. Question 3. Can I adjust the amount of starter? I wouldn't recommend using less starter than the recipe calls for unless you prefer your cookies to have a more cakey texture. Using a little more starter without changing the other ingredient measurements will impact the flavor and texture, but feel free to experiment and see what works best for you. This recipe is one that I created for myself after testing half a dozen others, and this is what I found my customers and I enjoyed most. If you're watching this and thinking, I don't have a sourdough starter yet, or I'm not sure how to maintain mine, I have something for you. My Sourdough Starter Success Bundle walks you through everything: how to create a starter from scratch, how to maintain it, and how to troubleshoot problems. It's just $3 and includes a 7-day checklist, a troubleshooting guide, and 3 discard muffin recipes. The link is in the description and pinned to the first comment. If you want to start your sourdough journey the right way, grab that bundle. Okay, back to the cookie dough. Next, I'm adding 1 large egg and 1 egg yolk. Both should be at room temperature if possible. It helps everything just mix more smoothly. And then 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract. Mix until everything is well combined, and the mixture should be pretty smooth and cohesive. Now for the dry ingredients. I'm adding 320 grams of all-purpose flour, which is about 2.5 cups, followed by 1 teaspoon each of baking soda, baking powder, and fine sea salt. I'm adding all of this directly to the wet ingredients. Stir until you see a few ribbons of flour still remaining. You don't want to overmix. We want the dough to be just combined. I'm mixing by hand towards the end because there's flour at the bottom of the bowl that needs to be incorporated, but notice that there is still a little flour visible even after hand mixing. Now we add the chocolate chips. I'm using 120 grams of mini chocolate chips for this recipe. I prefer mini chocolate chips because you get more chips throughout each cookie per gram, but you're welcome to use regular sized chocolate chips, chocolate chunks, dark chocolate, milk chocolate, semi-sweet, whatever you like. You can even stir in some nuts or dried fruit. Just make it the way you like it. Once again, I'm using my hand to ensure that the chips are evenly distributed. And there's our dough. Now it's time to shape and chill the dough before baking. I cut a large piece of plastic wrap and then put the dough on top so I can wrap it up and roll the dough into a tube shape, which I'll demonstrate. You can also do this with parchment paper. I've just found that sometimes it can be a little more cumbersome to use parchment paper. And for the ease of time, I decided to use plastic wrap this morning. This makes it just really easy to slice it later when you have it in this tube shape. Now I have a couple of options for storage. I can either store this in the refrigerator for at least an hour or for up to 3 days, or I can put it in the freezer and leave it there for up to 3 months. Here I refrigerated the dough before baking. While the dough was chilling, I lined my baking sheet with parchment paper. Since I was in a time crunch, I decided to use a dough scraper to measure out 76 grams of dough for each cookie, shape them into discs, and place them a few inches apart on the cookie sheet before putting it into the fridge to chill faster than if I left the whole tube of dough intact. Then, about 5 minutes before chill time ended, I preheated my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit and then put my cookie sheet in the oven on the middle rack. When baking refrigerated dough, it usually takes about 10 to 12 minutes in my oven, but will take additional time when baking from frozen. You know they are done when they are golden, slightly puffed, and smell amazing. But here's a little trick. After removing the cookie sheet from the oven, hover it a few inches above the counter or stovetop and let it drop. I recommend doing this on a counter rather than your stove. This will help the cookies settle evenly. The final touch is to sprinkle them with a little coarse sea salt. This is totally optional, but it really enhances the flavor, balances the sweetness, and brings out the toffee notes from the browned butter. I recommend letting them sit on the baking sheet for about 5 minutes, then transfer them to a cooling rack, either directly or still on the parchment paper. And there they are, browned butter sourdough chocolate chip cookies. If you love this recipe and want more ways to use your sourdough discard, my Sourdough Starter Success Bundle includes 3 more discard recipes, muffins that are just as delicious as these cookies. For just $3, you get the starter guide, troubleshooting tips, and those recipes. The link is in the description and pinned to the first comment. This is the kind of recipe that makes maintaining a sourdough starter completely worth it. So that's it, brown butter sourdough chocolate chip cookies, a delicious way to use up your discard and a recipe you'll want to make again and again. If you're new to sourdough or want to learn more about creating and maintaining a starter, check out my From Starter to Slice playlist, where I walk you through everything from rescuing a neglected starter to baking a beautiful loaf. Click the video on your screen to start the series, and remember to subscribe so you never miss a recipe or tutorial. Happy baking, and remember, never throw away your healthy starter. There's always something delicious you can make with it. Rise, nourish, connect.